to chair. I'm kind of new to the organization. I really didn't know this organization existed until 9 months ago. I have a blog and a website. I'm interested in end-of-life issues, and I will leave my business card in the back if you want to take a look at my website. It's called finalexodus.org. So this morning we have 5 speakers. The first 3, we're going to change the schedule slightly. The first 3 speakers will have 35 minutes, including their own question and answer period.
Am I in your way?
So if they go 35 minutes talking, they will not have any question and answer period. It's the only way we can keep on schedule. So there is no open discussion anytime this morning. At 10:45, we will take the break as scheduled, and then we'll resume again promptly at 11 o'clock. So I think the 2 speakers that I have here are aware of that, and we'll get started. Our first speaker, and if Dr. Egbert comes in, would he come up front and acknowledge himself to me? That would be good. Our first speaker is Elaine Feuer. She's also from Southern California. She recently published a book, To Gently Leave This Life, which she is selling here today. And it examines the history of the right to die movement, including the legal cases and legislation. She has worked in the medical division of a large publishing company, as well as worked in film and movies. And she tells me she's currently trying to move from Los Angeles to New York. So right now she's in Michigan, so she's on her way. So Elaine, it's all yours.
Good morning. I'd like to start up with a video, which is a video version of my book. I think you'll enjoy it. It's 8 minutes.
In my thoughts I have seen rings of smoke through the trees, and the voices of those who stand up. What makes me wonder?
Thank you. I'm here to talk about my new book, and as you can see with the video, it's really a video reflection of To Gently Leave This Life, The Right to Die. It's an honor to be here. My book is about the history of the Right to Die movement, and of late, the various countries and states, and now Quebec, that have assisted death legislation. In 1992, Sue Rodriguez, an ALS patient, sent a videotape to Canadian Parliament. In it, she asked them two sentences. If I cannot give consent to my own death, whose body is this? Who owns my life? I cannot think of two sentences more poignant than those, and it's why all of us are here today. In 1993, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled 5-4 against Sue, and a year later, with the help of an anonymous doctor, Sue attained the assisted death that Canada's Supreme Court had denied her. 2 decades later, Gloria Taylor, another ALS patient, was given a personal exemption for assisted death. This was huge. In 2012, the first time in Canada that anyone was given the right to die. A few months later, Gloria was in the hospital, and she ended up dying from an infection. But it had given her enormous relief, because as all of you know, ALS is a horrific, horrific disease. So she at least knew that when it got to the point that she couldn't take it anymore, she could get assisted help to die. So that's what happened in 2012. And actually, in Canada right now, the Supreme Court is still considering that case because there are other people involved. But they could very well come up with a decision this year for assisted death, because Quebec just passed into law assisted death legislation. They're working on it right now, but from what I know, I think it's going to be a lot like Belgium's laws. It's going to be more voluntary euthanasia than death with dignity when you take your own prescription versus a lethal injection. So, when we think about Sue and Gloria and the nobility of death with dignity laws and voluntary euthanasia laws, what we are truly talking about is the power and magic of the human heart. It is from our deepest pain and heartbreak that we understand the true meaning of love, wisdom, and compassion towards those who are suffering. I'm talking about an awareness that happens when one embraces life's difficulties, an awareness that the Greek playwright Aeschylus wrote about. And even in our sleep, pain falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. This is what I'm talking about. This is the type of awareness I'm talking about, because assisted death is fundamentally an act of compassion. A good death, a peaceful death, a happy death has been longed for since the beginning of time. I became involved with the Right to Die movement as a result of living with my mother the last year of her life. She had metastatic breast cancer that spread to her left lung and her left heart lining. The weekend before she went into the hospital, she had to lean against a wall to steady herself. She left a burner on the stove, and she became delirious. But it was those last 7 weeks of her life in the hospital that were the worst. She wasn't given enough pain medication. Everyone always says you get plenty of pain medication. That's not true, because they're worried if they give you more morphine, it will kill you. She worried most about her dignity, and there was very little dignity in suffering, the kind of suffering she was doing in becoming delirious and not knowing if she could understand me or I could understand her. And a few days before she passed on, she could only whistle. No, she could only whisper at this point. It was very hard to even hear her whispering. Suddenly, this booming voice came back, and she said, "I want to go home, I want to go home, I want to go home," over and over and over again. Didn't matter what I said, nurses and doctors came in. She did that over and over again until she had no energy left for anything. She couldn't do anything by herself ever again. A few days later, a nurse came up to me and she asked, "Do you want us to set up a hospice vigil for you?" And I declined because my mother was a private person and she wouldn't want people she didn't know in her room watching her die. So later that evening, actually it was about 5 p.m., I moved my chair up right next to her bed. I took her hand and I said, "Mom, you can release yourself from this torture." And she blinked twice, and that meant yes. So we just stayed like that all night. I held her hand, just looking at each other, really. And at 5 a.m., she passed on. There is absolutely no way that she would have gone to that hospital if she would have had the choice of assisted death. If she could have had an injection at home or taken prescriptions, there was no reason in the world for her to have to suffer those 7 weeks. And that's what got me involved in this movement and in my book. I knew after that experience with my mother that I was going to write a book. When I was starting to research this book, and I love history, so I'm going through the history and also finding beautiful illustrations and quotations. It's an enjoyable book, it really is. I thought, number one, what does the average person want to know? Because this may shock people in here. The average person is not even aware that there is a right to die movement. They don't know it even exists. I'm talking about college educated, high school educated. I talked to a woman a couple weeks ago in West Virginia, and she said to me, "If I get Alzheimer's, I want to find a Dr. Kevorkian. Because I know it's wrong and it may be illegal, but that's what I want." And when I told her there were 5 states where that was possible right now, you could get a prescription, she couldn't believe it. People all over this country do not know about this. So I believe it is absolutely crucial that we have to educate people in their 20s, 30s, 40s. Get them into this movement. If they are educated, they're going to become motivated, and that will get things going so fast. I think we'll be stunned at what a big movement it will become. That's the goal of my book. That's what I've had from the very beginning. So it's an easy-to-read book. It's you can pick it up anywhere if you just want to go to one particular topic or read about Karen Quinlan, or you can read it from the beginning to the end. But it's really for the average person, for people in the movement who want to know the history of it and the various cases that changed legislation. And it's enjoyable. People have told me it's enjoyable. So that's the goal of my book. I thought I would talk about a few people that I wrote about. Karen Quinlan. She was 21, age 21. She ingested Valium and alcohol, and this sent her into a coma. By the time paramedics arrived, she had lost oxygen to her brain. So she was in the hospital for months. They were trying to revive her, bring any kind of die peacefully. However, the state of New Jersey did not want this. The Quinlans had to go to court, and a guardian was appointed by the judge to represent Karen. And the guardian said what the Quinlans were talking about was euthanasia, which is illegal in New Jersey at that time. So the parents lost that court case. They then went to the Supreme Court, and the judge there said, Karen should not be asked to endure the unendurable. So the Quinlans were able to take Karen off life support, but she still had a feeding tube, and she lived for 10 more years. And in the autopsy, it showed most of her brain was damaged. So, just one second. Get some water. So, what came out of Karen's death was the first living will. People could now decide if they don't want to be hooked up to the respirator, make sure that won't happen. If they want to sign a DNR, do not resuscitate. If they want a medical proxy to make decisions for them, if they cannot make their own decisions. Enormous advanced medical practices were a result of Karen's death. Hospices became big, ethics committees in hospitals around the country. And the one question, how far do we go with medical technology to prolong life? That's a question where there is no answer to. Medical technology is going to continue to go on, but we can decide how far we want to go with our living will. And I think at this point, only about 25% of people have a living will. But this is what came out of Karen's death. Everyone in here probably knows about Jack Kevorkian, right? Dr. Kevorkian, more than anyone else, brought the assisted death movement into mainstream in the US, in Canada, and even in Europe. He could be outrageous. He would do anything to get people talking about doctor-assisted death. He felt it was a doctor's duty to take a patient that was dying, to help that patient die peacefully. So he was loved and hated. He was on television shows, on radio shows, front pages of newspapers all over. So in 1998, when he sent a videotape of him injecting Thomas Yuck with a lethal injection, potassium chloride, and they showed this on 60 Minutes. Jack Kevorkian knew that this was going to send him to prison because it was against the law. He had lost his medical licenses in California and in Michigan. So he went to prison in order to make people's lives better, in order to help those who are suffering, to have a peaceful death. And I think he's a hero. And what he did, I mean, he sacrificed himself for everyone else. And he's helped 130 people who were in pain and dying. He gave them a peaceful death. I'd like to talk a little bit about Tony Nicholson. In 2012, he went before the High Court in Britain. Tony was this fabulous man, an engineer, living life to the fullest, the type of person who, when you walked into a room, everyone would be surrounding him. He had a catastrophic stroke, locked in, totally locked in. The only thing he could do was blink, blink. They were able to find him a computer program with a camera because he wanted to write his own letter to the court. And can you imagine blinking a different amount of times for each letter? That's what he did. And he's brilliant doing it too. And this went to Britain's High Court, and all three judges said this is not going to happen at this time. In other words, he cannot get assisted death, voluntary euthanasia. They wouldn't even think about it. So he had been like this for 7 years. 7 years locked in. He stopped eating and drinking and died 10 days later from pneumonia. So it's incredibly sad that people like Tony are all over the place, and that's the way they have to die. The new health minister at the time in Britain was horrified that people were leaving their homes, their country, to go to Switzerland, where Dignitas will help you die. It's the only place where you can go for assisted suicide or assisted death in Switzerland. So there is a lot of tourism aid in dying, and since 1939, Switzerland has passed a law that it is legal if you want to take your own life. So if people fly into Switzerland, they can take their own life. What they don't allow is a doctor helping. So euthanasia is not allowed, but they consider suicide rational. So if people go there very ill, they can meet with Dignitas, and they've already sent their medical records to them, and they can get a prescription. They're taken to an apartment, and it's so expensive, and they have to have people traveling with them. Most people can't do this, but there are some well-known people who've gone there. Doctors have been on YouTube saying, "I'm going there now. I'm not depressed. I'm not even sad. I'm in pain. It's time for me to go with my head held high." Dr. John Elliott wrote that type of letter on the front page of a Sydney, Australian newspaper. So I think right now is a great time to get things going, bring more people into the movement, have laws passed so that it's not illegal to die in your own home, in your own bed, whenever possible. So that it's not illegal to decide how and when, if possible, how and when you are going to die. So my goal, as I said earlier, is to educate people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, all the way. And that, I think, would bring the motivation necessary. People would jump on the bandwagon. Celebrities would become involved. It can be huge, and I think it's very possible. So that's the goal of my book, and it would be nice if it was a goal of some of these Right to Die organizations as well. So I think that's the way to really move fast and make changes in countries all over the world. So thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, and I'm looking forward to listening to everybody else. Oh, I guess we have 5 more minutes. Yeah.
In your research, have you determined what is the best way to reach this group, the 20, the 30, the 40-year-olds? Have you found what is, for those of us who are struggling with, how do we get that message out? What would you recommend?
That's a good question, because one of the people who runs a prominent Right to Die organization, she didn't want to even look at my book. She said, the movement's important, not a book. And to the person I was dealing with, I said, doesn't she realize that people have to be educated and then motivated? And he agreed with me, but we have to get people in there who want to make changes within the group. I think that's where my aim is with my book. But I think you could go to medical schools and talk. I think a big campaign can be made in the U.S., in Canada, because things are really moving in Canada. And I think things have to be changed instead of the same old stuff all the time. And somehow getting younger people involved, because they will be interested in this if they find out about it. It's just that people don't know about it. So yeah, I'm going to do my best with hopefully promotion. Maybe I can get on TV shows, whatever, to push my book. And did you want to? answer? Sure, go ahead.
Another question. Can you amplify a little bit the distinction between voluntary euthanasia and assisted death? I think you mentioned it in relation
Right.
to Bill.
Would you repeat the question, please?
Yes. I'd like some information about the distinction between voluntary euthanasia and assisted death. What's the difference?
Okay, well, euthanasia is with a doctor injecting a patient with a fatal drug. Voluntary is used in front of euthanasia because people don't want euthanasia alone used, reminding people of the Holocaust, maybe the Nazis. Although I know in Canada people talk about euthanasia all the time. Voluntary euthanasia isn't used there. I don't know if it's used in Europe either. It's in the States that people are very cognizant about wanting that. Assisted death, well, assisted death can mean getting a prescription strong enough to kill you, which is that's what the option is here in the 5 states in the U.S. But assisted death could mean a doctor injecting you too with a substance. But sometimes the language doesn't really make sense. I think what you really need to know is that in Europe and in Quebec, doctors are going to be assisting by giving a lethal injection, whereas in the U.S., you're going to have to get a prescription. Doctors are not allowed to inject you. So, yes.
We only have time for one more question.
Sure.
You mentioned medical school. That's a little tougher to get your foot in the door, and there are a lot less of them. But undergraduate school, most have death education classes these days, and they're frequently looking for a guest speaker. And I wonder if you might pursue that to reach the younger folk.
Yeah, that's a great idea because I really believe once they just start to know a little bit about this, they would be 90% of them would be going for this. They understand it. I'm sure that's what would happen. Did you want one more question?
Really, we need to move on. Let's give Elaine another hand.
Thank you.
So is Dr. Egbert here? He's coming up, I think. So I will introduce him while he comes up. Many of you know him already. He's a anesthesiologist, a former professor at Johns Hopkins Medical Center in Maryland. He is known to us as the great stand-up person for Final Exit Network. As the medical director of Final Exit, he was prosecuted 3 times and went to jail at least once. And he's here to tell us about his experiences in that role and how those experiences have affected his reputation, his license, and his mental health. Dr. Larry Egbert.
Come on in. The door's unlocked. 4 men came into my office. They came up the stairs, 4 men in their 30s. They had their guns out. They had bulletproof shields on. And they said at the top of their lungs, "You're under arrest." Handcuffs on. And then what happened, I found out later, they'd done the same thing to my wife at home. The difference was only the location. And not only that, I found out later, where's Nick? Anyway, that my colleague, Nick Sheridan, he got a call on his cell phone from his daughter in high school. And his daughter said, there are men knocking on our door. So the police had come to. What it turned out was that these are Baltimore homicide cops. They were polite and correct as long as I was in handcuffs. And we sat around for a couple of hours and waited for the Georgia police to come. In the cell that they assigned me downtown, I was under PC, they call it. PC means protective custody. They're afraid of the other prisoners might hurt you. The interesting thing about PC in Baltimore was that they put me in my own private cell on the psychological ward, the psych ward. So when I got a chance to walk, they gave me a little break every now and so I could walk around in a room about a quarter of the size of this room. And I'd walk around and I would talk to the other psychotic patients. I got a chance to call my wife. At home, what happened was that they wanted to look through my stuff at my little study at home, and my wife said, there's nothing there, he has everything at the office. But they went through and checked that also. What happened after that, they charged us bail. So Nick and I were ordered to appear in Georgia. We were on I don't know what he was on, but I was released on $60,000 worth of bail. So my wife had to go borrow on our house. There are good things about this, and one of the good things is getting a free book from Dick Cody. And Dick Cody put in front of his book, to Larry, who has sacrificed so much for so many. Another good thing was that Wendell Stevenson gave me a plaque. And the plaque said, what a fine fellow I am. But this idea, originally I thought there were going to be about 10 people in this room, and so I was planning to have a discussion. So this isn't going to be any discussion. I'm going to talk about myself. And I find it very weird. I actually have listened to myself on the tape recorder, and it is very, very a weird thing to do. People ask me all the time, how am I? And even now, about 6 years later, but they don't want to hear. A lot of times they'll very quietly start tuning out. So that often if you ask me how I am, I'll say fine, and leave it at that. But every once in a while somebody asks, and so when they ask me to give a talk, I did never entered my mind that I'd give this talk. What I started was preparing a talk saying that I was why are we doing this? Why are you all doing this? You just heard me talk about why somebody's doing this. So this kind of thing. I had this talk and was good, I hope to be a good talk, and turned out Faye said, no, you're not going to do that. She told me that I was the most arrested person in the United States. Now, I'm not Philip Nietzsche, and I'm not, well, anyway, Dr. Irwin. I think they've got me beat. They both lost their licenses. They both have met the police. What I am going to do is remind myself being depressed, if I look depressed, I often am. I sit down and I think about all sorts of things that have been unpleasant in my life. Being arrested is lonely. The cops in Baltimore put me with I was the only old person I saw in the 3 days that I was in the Baltimore jail. I was also the only white person. Is there a black person in the room? Wow. So this is a very white, and I gather in Oregon it's pretty much a white subject too. But the Asians and the black people don't use this very much. Well, I got out and I got in touch with Robert Rivas by telephone. And Robert, he kept saying, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God," over and over again. And I wrote down, Rob, that this was very unlawyerly of you. So, I'll also remind you that there's been articles about a nurse in Philadelphia by the name of Mancini. And Barbara Mancini, in describing her year of dealing with the courts and the lawyers as a year of hell. It's just pure misery. And all she did was give her father his own morphine, and he took it. So then the courts went after her. I'm also reminded repeatedly of my father. My father was an international lawyer who was assigned to keep the record of the first trials for the Nazis in Nuremberg. And when he agreed to do that, they took him, the United States was advancing in southern Germany, and they took him to Munich. And so the Americans were shooting at the Germans, and the Germans were shooting at the Americans while they retreated. And so he got to see Dachau in the raw. My father was a very cheery kind of person. But when he got home, they gave him vacation. He came back to Washington. I grew up in Washington. And he came back to Washington. He was sitting in the backyard just like this. For hours. He just sat there. The utter horror of what human beings can do to other human beings simply staggers the imagination. So I'm making a recommendation. Dr. Stevenson hasn't heard this yet, but now he maybe will. Artsenzunder Grenzen. That's Medicine Sans, that's Doctors Without Borders. Doc has an office in Amsterdam, and when you go work for Doctors Without Borders, they assume that you're in a traumatic situation. So automatically, you're assigned as you're on your way home to see a psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist is a specialist in post-traumatic stress disorder, and he'll sit and chat with you as long as he thinks necessary, and will make a recommendation if you need more therapy. And I think that's a good idea. I think people who are stressed that we go through should be dealt with formally and occasionally quite actively. Now, what happened to me after I got back from Georgia, where you were released on bail, as I said, and got back to Baltimore? Well, I had a job. I had 4 different jobs at Johns Hopkins University. I was a professor of anesthesia. I also interviewed pre-med students who wanted to go to medical school, and I helped teach a course in what doctors dealing with patients. So it's called a physician-patient course. We had senior medical students, my colleague and I got an email suggesting that I resign from that. I was the Unitarian campus minister for the Unitarian students, and I was fired from that. Can you imagine firing a volunteer? The only job that I was kept was the anesthesia department. Did not fire me. The professor of anesthesia, I report. So I called the professor of anesthesia, our new chairman, has been told that I will be here in case he wants to get in touch. The assumption is that the university does not want to associate. There's a history of that. When there's a problem at a university, the university goes to lengths to separate itself from the university. I see somebody from the university nodding her head. So the editor of the Unitarian Universalist World magazine said that they wouldn't publish an article about this. So they had published previously an article about my work with the death penalty. We have a lively group in the Unitarians who are opposed to the death penalty, and that's actually how I got interested in this subject. I got interested in this subject because one day my minister called me up at the hospital and asked me, would I do an execution? No, she shouldn't use the word, but would I do an anesthetic so somebody who wanted to die? And after a little while, I checked with her, and I said, well, you know, the state of Texas, I was living in Texas at the time, the state of Texas would call that murder. And it'd be murder one, probably. And so I don't think I should do that by myself. Are you joining me in this? And she said yes. So I went to see the patient, and the patient's daughter talked her out of it. Excuse me.
Is the technician here? I'd like to get the lights on back here. I think he snuck out. I have no idea which switch to push.
Every now and then, I find myself just staring, sort of like my father did, and every now and then, I don't pay attention to when my wife is talking to me, so I'm thinking of something else, and she's nodding her head right now to verify that. I think of the prosecuting attorneys. I've now listened to several prosecuting attorneys, and they don't say very nice things about me. So they got up and I remember in Arizona, when we had the case in Arizona, Faye can tell you about, Faye took notes of the whole time there. The prosecuting attorney reported what a nasty person I was, and how, doing something that was just basically wrong and criminal. And fortunately, then my attorney from Atlanta, got up and neutralized all that. So basically, both of them, each wants to win his or her own case. So, but she, for example, referred to the patient's home where the death occurred. The patient home is the victim's home. So she referred to the patient who we thought had helped as a victim. I think about the juries staring at me, and I was told, the thing that I remember and sort of laugh about is my attorney had an assistant, a colleague, and her name was Kristen Wright Novik. Kristen is a young woman. She's quite an attractive young woman, and my lawyer said to her to make sure that I behaved properly. So here's this attractive young woman telling me, don't stare at the jury. They were allowed to stare at me, but don't stare at the jury. But look at them every now and then. So it was that fiction tie. So this degrading sort of situation. So I kept thinking about the weird situation in the court. Nowadays, I have trouble with the state of Maryland. The state of Maryland and the state of Minnesota. You can get easy reports on the state of Minnesota, but the state of Maryland, the professor of medicine, this is where I had attended there to medical school myself. The professor there, he told me that what I was doing was immoral, improper, and to have a colleague sort of quietly talking to the court about what kind of doctor, that I was the wrong kind of doctor and shouldn't be a doctor, and I should lose my license. Also, I will say, related to that, the Final Exit Network withdrew. and refused to support me economically. So I'm paying for my own lawyer there. When I go to Minnesota, Final Exit Network pays for the expenses of doing that. One of the things that's odd is to think back on other things. I remember one time I was managing an intensive care unit, and I had taken a patient off of the respirator, not anybody's permission, and because we had a patient who in the recovery room who could probably survive, and we were quite sure that the patient who was using the respirator wasn't going to make it. So we took her off the respirator. And I think of the guilt feelings that I've had that come back every now and then. And say, oh boy, that was a very tricky thing to do that, and say that the proper practice of medicine. I remember also one time on the train coming from New York back to Washington that a young man committed suicide on the train. So he jumped in front of our train going 60 miles an hour. They stopped the train because they wanted to, and asked people to get out and look for body parts so they could find out who it was. So finally they found enough so they could identify the dead boy. I had an article written about me in Washington Post. It was quite well written, and the author he had over 1,000 photographs. He went to a convention where I was at the convention, and he had a picture of me doing this, sort of waving around like that, and dancing with joy and fun. And the odd thing about that is how much interesting things. I mean, being with you all, at least I don't have any exceptions at the present time. It's been quite interesting. You're an interesting bunch of people to talk to. But the author of the Washington Post article referred to me as the second Jack Kevorkian. That idea actually came from Newsweek magazine, where a young woman came down. She heard I was going to preach at the church for the Humans Association, and so she asked, could she come? I said, sure. I asked them, I said, okay, a newspaper reporter came from Newsweek, and they said, sure. So she came. Well, she was then saying, well, here I was, like also another Jack Kevorkian. Dr. Kevorkian was referred to as a number of times as a lunatic. He did unnatural research. I read an article of him about how he wanted to do research on prisoners on death row. And it's a fascinating but very, very interesting and odd article that usually doctors don't write about. The question is, well, how creepy am I? So I'm thinking about how creepy am I, and sometimes I'm quite aware that people think this is creepy. I have been told that I'm very, or quite often, quite confrontational, and I think that's true. That I am quite confrontational every now and then, but I suspect that from the looks of the room, that so are a lot of you. Yeah. So anyway, the question is whether you like being this way. The answer, medical student came up to me one time. She said, I'm a senior. She was a senior at Johns Hopkins Medical School. She had her finger out like this to me, pointing it into my chest. And she said, I've been taught here to cure people. A lot of medical students, we're here to cure you of your illness. And then she says, pointing her finger again at me, she said, and along you come and start talking about comforting people all the time. So she was very angry. I mean, we're talking an anger that got to the dean. So that the idea of a student complaining about faculty is, well, confrontational is a word. Jack Kevorkian lost his license, both in California and also, I think you mentioned that, and in Michigan. I had a consultation with a fellow by the name of Quill, Timothy Quill. You've been interested in this for more than a few days. You've heard the name. Tim Quill was very glad to take consultation. So if I needed consultation, I could call him up and he was welcome. What he did not want to do was be associated with Final Exit Network publicly, because it would be associated at that time with Jack Kevorkian. I could do the same thing with Dick McDonald. And I could call up Dick McDonald and ask him questions if I was not quite sure about what the patient's condition and that sort of thing, and that was good. The question I asked myself every now and then was, why was I doing this? And the answer that I think is because it's good. It's the proper thing to do. I had a patient one time. She was a retired psychiatrist in Boston, and her daughter came all the way back. Her daughter was an internist in England, London, and her daughter came back to sit with her and hold her hand while she was dying. She was going to breathe helium. And before she started breathing her helium, she said, well, can I say something? I said, sure, of course you're going to say something. So she said, well, I have been an atheist all my adult life. She sort of looked down and then she sort of looked us straight in the eye and she said, God bless you. My theory right now is that Final Exit Network would like to forget about the court. They would like to have the court stop its work. The Final Exit Network now has in writing, takes care of people, I'm quoting now, with physical serious diseases. And I put down beside that note myself, and not the psychological patients. The assumption then is that psychologically sick people aren't uncomfortable, don't have pain. It's all reversible, of course, if you have psychological, it's just in your head. And so the difference between what you should have heard, the argument the board had when they decided to take psychological patients. And I was not on the board, but I was invited to the telephone, to pick my telephone, and I asked that question. Psychological persons can suffer and can be chronic, and can be hopeless. This is basically what we have said, and now say for physical illnesses. This makes us like compassionate choices. The compassionate choices will say the same thing. In Baltimore, we had compassionate choices and Final Exit Network met together. When we were talking about this, we met several times a year. One of our members was a former health officer for the state of New Jersey, and she had been there during the time of Karen Ann Quinlan's dealings with the law. And when I think of the difficulties with this, I can also think of when I'm talking with Mr. Humphrey. And he got more money to get legal cases when the state of Georgia blocked our money. And so the state of Georgia essentially had all our money quarantined in the banks, and we didn't have any money. So, well, Derek I called him up one time when I got back out on bail myself, and he said he had over $100,000 and it was being usefully used. So here people really cared about the issue and were willing to chip in and do something. There are ups and downs. So the idea of being depressed all the time, I'm not depressed all the time. And sometimes and Dr. Cohen is a psychiatrist in the Boston area in western Massachusetts. He's interviewed some of the people here, and he basically is writing a book about a doctor doing this. He was going to do this with 4 different doctors, and he so far has worked mainly on worked me over. I also have and she was sitting on the beach one time down in Massachusetts and talking with a good friend of hers, his name was Alan Dershowitz. And Alan Dershowitz was talking about this case, and something my daughter says, well, Alan, that's my father. So, and that's nice. I had an amazingly nice thing happen one time. I asked the patient, I was quite nervous about doing this. I asked the patient, could I have her bag after she was through using it to give to a person who didn't have the money, to spare money? And she was thrilled. The fascinating thing is that is I now have in my office in Baltimore 7 or 8 bags, and the Georgia police went right past them and never found them. All my files, but they didn't do. So. We agreed, the patient and I, that the patient who would use her bag in the future wouldn't be worried about bacteria. Ladies and gentlemen, I have thought about other issues that are related. And that is, I have a picture in my office of a fellow by the name of George Tiller. George Tiller is from Kansas City, or was from Kansas City, and he did 3rd trimester abortions. And one day, a man walked into his church and shot him dead. People who are opposed to what we're doing are very strongly opposed, like the idea of abortion. So I look at George Tiller every now and then, and I'm thinking of a woman by the name of Elke Basner, who I've not met, who was president of the German Right to Die organization, DGHS, and she was attacked by a man who threw butter acid in her face. She now has skin problems and visual problems, I'm told. Well, there are ups and downs, around and around. I think it would be a very good idea for people who are getting arrested that they get to talk with a psychiatrist who's interested in this kind of work. Thank you.
We have a few more questions. You want to answer questions for a couple minutes?
Oh, sure.
Anybody have a question of Dr. Egbert? Also, is the technician in the audience or in the back of the room, because we need to set up the computer again for the next speaker. Question there.
Thank you very much. That was an interesting talk. Could you just give a brief description of what happened in Georgia, why the police, because I think some people don't know, for instance, the healing method was that.
Yeah. I'm not going to describe the healing method. You could get Derek's 3rd edition of his book, and it has a very nice description of the healing method. The patient there who died was had a cancer that had eaten off half his face, half his lower half of his jaw, and he had terrible pain. And what Georgia did was they set up a situation where they had a patient who said that he had cancer of the pancreas. Cancer of the pancreas is notorious for causing no symptoms until suddenly horrible symptoms. And so that you could look quite good with cancer of the pancreas until relatively near the end. So he said he had this. He got doctors to essentially forge his health record, and he caught Ted Goodwin and his colleague. Ted Goodwin was the guide, was one of the guides. So they were both arrested and taken to jail. And as Ted and I have talked, we had realized that we were under rather similar circumstances. Does that answer your question okay?
Yeah, so it was kind of entrapment by the state of Georgia?
Yeah, entrapment's the quite, I forget the word for that, but sting, that's right. It was a sting. So, thank you.
One more question. Yes.
Your experience, Larry, would be intimidating to any potential exit guy. Is Final Exit Network having more trouble finding them? And do you have any suggestions on how to reduce the intimidation?
The question is Final Exit having trouble getting more exit guides in view of Larry's experience?
All I know is the earlier part of that question, and that is that a lot of people, a couple of them I've met here, at the time resigned from Final Exit Network. The New England group of guides, almost half of them resigned. One of our coordinators coordinator for the mental poverty in the United States at that time. He resigned. So that the idea, the current medical director has said very clearly that he isn't going to do one single thing that would get him one single day in jail. And I was fascinated with that because that's what we were doing, that we might get one day in jail. He said the same thing to Ted Goodwin. So Ted Goodwin, you notice that Ted Goodwin is not here. And neither is the former president of this organization, who's not from Australia, who's not here. So,
All right. Thank you. Yes, you're done. I'm sorry. So our next speaker is Belli. That has an Italian pronunciation, and I'm not good at any language, including English, so I may not have that quite right. She's from Argentina. She has a PhD in philosophy. She is currently a postdoctoral research fellow at Argentina's National Council of Scientific and Technological Research. She has been working on ethical issues for the past 10 years surrounding the end-of-life decisions. So this should be a very interesting talk on the ethics of end-of-life decisions. Laura will talk to us about Argentina's dignified death law adopted in 2012 by unanimous vote of the legislature. Laura, it's all yours.
Good morning to everybody. I would like to thank the World Federation of Right to Die Societies and the Final Exit members. Okay. I'm much louder without a microphone, but with the microphone I'm like a little bit ashamed. And all of you for being here and letting me speak today about what's happening in my country. If you excuse me, I'm going to read because I'm not that fluent in English. So. In 2011, in Argentina, heavily driven by two relevant cases, began a polarized public debate about dying with dignity. I was lucky to be able to participate in two cases. I know the people involved in these two cases because I work in a bioethics committee of the medicine faculty of the University of Buenos Aires, and we work with all the people involved in getting these two girls to be able to die quietly and peacefully, and this was like really important in Argentina to get to the new law that we have now in dignified death. Let me talk about Melina Gonzalez. When she was 3 years old, Melina Gonzalez was diagnosed with neurofibromatosis. It is a genetic disorder that disturbs cells' growth in the nervous system, causing tumors to form on nerve tissue. All through her childhood and adolescence, she underwent many surgeries to remove the tumors, but by the time she was 19 years old, the pain became unbearable and she pleaded to be allowed to die. She went on the media, she was on the newspapers, she talked to journalists, and her case was really known in Argentina. But the justice refused her petition, although her mother and her family were beside her and really agreed with her petition. And she finally died a few months later, when she was almost 20 years old. And she was sedated illegally, right? So she died of natural causes for the justice, but the reality is that she was sedated by some great physicians in the children's hospitals. The second one, Camila, was a little girl who was born in 2009. Selva Arbon was her mother, and the baby lacked of oxygen during childbirth and was in a persistent vegetative state for 3 years. She was kept on life support against her parents' wishes. Camila's mother, Selva, fought for a dignified death law in Argentina to allow patients and their relatives to refuse life-sustaining treatment. When the law passed in 2012, Camila was taken off the ventilator and died. Before talking about the scope of the new law, I think it is important to contextualize this debate. Like many Latin American countries, in Argentina there is no real separation of the church and the state, not by law and certainly not in reality. The Roman Catholic Church is sustained by the state and holds a dominant place in society. The state gives around 32 million pesos a year to the church and 6 billion pesos a year for sustaining Catholic schools, public schools. As stated in our national constitution, the federal government sustains the Catholic Apostolic Roman religion, but it is not just an economic arrangement, but also a sort of moral union that justifies the undeniable influence that the church has in life and death issues. An example, we in Argentina only have legal abortion in just a few particular cases, so abortion is forbidden in almost all cases. And in these particular cases that it is permitted by law, it's really hard to get it done because physicians are afraid, because the public opinion is very strong against it. So same thing in like another dimension, but the same thing happens with right to die debate. The dignified death law, of course, was rejected by the Roman Catholic Church. The Catholic bishops reaffirmed the value of human life, and I quote, from conception until natural death. But it finally passed due to strong and continuous media and public support. On May 9, the law number 26742, known as Dignified Death Law, was enacted. The Senate passed the law by a vote of 55-0 with 17 abstentions and was promulgated on May 24 that same year. It incorporates, it's not a new law, it's a law that incorporates some amendments to the law 26529 on patients' rights in relation to the professionals and health institutions. And this is really important because we already have a law that allow us to refuse treatment in any cases. But this new law, the dignified death law, was supposed to enhance that other law, but really what it did was to narrow the scope of the things that we are allowed to do as patients. It's very important. And it's really, really interesting because they are both national laws and they contradict themselves. Our dignified death law was also greatly influenced by a provincial law, best one in Argentina, Rio Negro's 2008 law, the one at the bottom, states the patient has the right to respects the quality of life and dignity of the terminally ill and also supports the right of abstention or withdrawal of life support, and it's really important. But the Rio Negro law is only a province law, so it has no national range. So, if we had a law that was the patient's right law, and we had a new law, a dignified law, why was the new law necessary? Or was it necessary? The thing was, and I think that same thing happens here, nobody knows about patient rights. Not nobody, but at least majority of the public that doesn't work in these issues and is not related to this kind of debate are not aware that they have rights as patients, that they have rights on the way that they should or could or wish to die and end their lives. So the Dignified Death Law at first was thought as a law to bring in the public debate into the legislature and the Senate and everything and get the people a voice, yes, and try to fortify patients' rights. But it ended a little different. So I would like to stress the fact that the 2009 law already stated, the patient's right law, already stated the patient's right to refuse treatment. In Article 2, it states, I quote, "The patient has the right to accept or reject certain medical or biological therapies with or without providing reasons for his or her decision." And that's really important. You don't have to provide a reason of why you should or you want to reject medical treatment. In the most, an example, Jehovah's Witness case in Argentina. They are allowed to refuse treatment, and no physician rejects what they ask for, and everything works well because they have had over the years like important campaigns in public hospitals teaching physicians about advanced directives, about their wishes and their religious beliefs and everything. So that's a case where physicians feel comfortable to comply with the law. But in other cases, it's really, really different. And there also was a really important case, Parodi's case, that established a legal precedent. Angel Parodi was a diabetic and alcoholic man, a homeless man by the time he went into a hospital, who refused a double leg amputation and died as a result of that decision. And this case was really, really important because it gets to the court, of course. It was a milestone in the patient's rights debate in Argentina because the judge assigned to the case stated that the value of life against the will of the patient could not prevail when the principle of human dignity is at stake. So he made the decision based on the dignity of the patient, and the dignity included how he wanted to die, how he wanted to be treated in the hospital. But despite all of this, the dignified death law was enacted and reinforced certain topics while undermining others. Let me analyze this in detail. This law aims to make explicit the patient's right to refuse medical treatment and to request the limitation of treatment when these measures are extraordinary or disproportionate in relation to the prospect of improvement, and when the treatment is causing an excessive suffering in the patient. Article 1, the autonomous will article, states the patient has the right to accept or reject certain therapies or medical or biological procedures, expressing or not the cause, as well as to subsequently revoke his or her manifestation of the will. So far so good, the same as the other law. No problem here. This modification introduced by the new law is really important because it allows the patient to refuse medical treatment without having to explain the motives or reasons, ensuring their will and eliminating the interference from a third party, especially physicians. But here's the problem. The law follows. Under this authority, the patient that suffers an irreversible, incurable disease or is terminally ill or has suffered injuries that put him or her in the same situation. And this is an amendment of the patient's rights law that narrows the scope of individuals that can legally reject medical treatment. Now, it's not every patient. It's only patients that have irreversible, incurable disease or are terminally ill or have suffered from injuries that put her in the same situation. So, this is a step back, not a step forward from the other law. And it continues. And is properly informed, has the right to express his and her desire in terms of the rejection of such. The problem with this, and it's a problem that's all in every article of the law, I think, is that it doesn't make explicit what are extraordinary measures. And that's a problem that who work in bioethics have often. Extraordinary measures, ordinary measures, and everything. It's really hard to define. Yeah, so if the law is not explicit on this, it can give like a blurred lines and physicians don't know what to do. And I continue, to the prospect of improvement or produce an excessive suffering. The patient can also refuse artificial hydration and nutrition when they have the sole effect of prolonging the time of an irreversible or incurable terminal stage. And the same here, who decides when the patient is in a terminal state? And that's a really, really, really big problem, especially for a law, who was made to make clear all these little things. So it's really an issue. On the other side, one of the most remarkable aspects of this new law is that it makes explicit the right to receive palliative care at every step of the treatment process and at all stages of illness. Not only when you are in the final stages of illness, but from the first moment that you are diagnosed with any disease that causes you some suffering or pain, you have the right, and of course the physicians have the duty to receive palliative care, and it's really, really important. It says, in all cases, the refusal of rejection of the procedures mentioned above will not mean the disruption of those actions taken to achieve pain control and relief for the patient. Nowadays, palliative care programs are developing throughout the country, in part due to this new law, so this is really important, and I think it's a great step forward. Articles 2 and 3 of the law establish the requirement of informed consent. It reads, every professional performance in the medical health field, public or private, requires, in general and within the limits established by regulation, the prior informed consent of the patient. If the patient is disabled or unable to provide informed consent because of his or her physical or mental state, it can be given by relatives or designated representative of or legal guardian. And this might seem obvious, maybe for you, but in Argentina, many physicians are still working under the traditional paternalistic model, which places more weight on the duties that arise from beneficence than on the patient's right to self-determination. And this situation has certainly been undergoing substantial transformation in the past few years towards an increased respect for the autonomy of the patients. And important improvements have been achieved, like legislation on informed consent. But this is still a big problem in Argentina. What's more common than this is that physicians do not talk to the patient, but they talk to the families. So the decisions are made by the families, and the patients are kept in the dark. And this happens every day in every hospital in Argentina. Public, private, Catholic, non-Catholic, and it's really, really a big issue and really hard to change. I think the new generations are doing something to reverse the situation, but it's really a big problem. Article 6 reads, any capable person over the age of 18 may state an advanced healthcare directive to consent or refuse certain medical treatments, preventive or palliative, and decisions concerning their health. This is really important. This is the first legal recognition of advanced directives documents in Argentina, and it's certainly important in the process of increasing respect towards patient autonomy. However, the law states that these directives must be accepted by the attending physician except those involving euthanasia request, which will be considered as non-existent. And that line, in an article talking about advanced directives, is what the Catholic Church was able to do with this law. Explicitly forbids euthanasia. And it's really hard to change, and I think it will be impossible to change, because one is written down, and once the law is there, it's really hard to revoke it and write a new law, and that's a big issue. So That's, I think, the most important backlash of this new law that was supposed to help patients and increase autonomy. Article 7 is perhaps the most important for health professionals, but it's important also because it enables the implementation of this law without delay. This is really, really a big issue. It states that no professional who acted in accordance with the provisions of this law is subjected to civil, criminal, or administrative burdens arising from compliance with the law. It protects healthcare professionals who want to help people to die peacefully and to refuse treatment. Of course, in the cases that we mentioned before, right, when they are terminally ill, and etc., etc. But it's really important because it swipes away the fear of being legally pursued and to have to face the justice. Technically, I'm not a lawyer, but I ask some lawyers. Technically, you can't even have. It never gets to the court, but they don't take your. If you go to the justice and say, I want to prosecute this health professional, they're going to say no because it's explicit in the law. So it's really good because it doesn't make you delay what your right as a patient. So, up until now, a court order was needed to end treatment or remove life support. This law expanded the right of individuals, allowing some patients to refuse surgical procedures, hydration and nutrition, reanimation and life support system at the end of their lives. For those patients who have not prepared a healthcare directive and can no longer speak for themselves, this new law allows family members or legal representatives to make the ultimate decision on the patient's behalf. The law also is directed explicitly at reducing and limiting futile treatments, health measures that are taken for the sole purpose of prolonging the life of the patient without reasonable considerations about the quality of lives for themselves. And it also, while expanding the rights of patients, this law humanizes medical practice and helps to restore and fortify the patient-physician relationship. But just to end this presentation, there's a lot left to be done in Argentina surrounding these issues. And although it's considered to be an improvement, in the past, getting approval from judges to remove life support was really, really difficult. This law strictly forbids euthanasia, and that's a problem. The absence of references to cases in which health professionals refuse to comply with requests from patients or the representatives on ground of conscientious objection can be an obstacle to the law enforcement. And this is not a minor subject. The second one is not a minor subject because many Catholic health physicians, 72% of Argentina is Catholic, so many Catholic physicians are against this law and say, I don't want to comply with it on the grounds of conscientious objection, which is protected by our national constitution. So what should we do in those cases? Because they are public servers, we have a public healthcare system in Argentina. So they have the duty to comply with the law, but also they have the right to abstain from that because of conscientious objection. And this is a really big problem. The law doesn't say anything about that. How do you guarantee that your right as a patient is going to be respected if the hospital has no physician that is willing to comply with the law? And it's really, really important. And the law is silent about this. And it's a really big problem. And of course, we still need to train physicians to respect the law and the patient's autonomy. They still have to learn to focus on the quality of life instead of preserving life at all costs. Thank you.
We have some time left, so we'll take questions, and I will take the burden of repeating the question so all of you can hear it. So, do you want to pick the questionnaire, or do you want me to? Me. All right, the lady in green.
Thank you. I'm from Mexico. I was listening as my talking about Mexico.
Cannot hear. Cannot hear.
Well, let me give her, it's more of a statement, I guess, than a question.
No, Ana question. I'm from Mexico, so I was listening as if she were speaking of Mexico in many ways, about the law, about the paternalistic relation of, and it is for it. We have a very similar law, but euthanasia is, of course, explicitly forbidden and assisted suicide. And my question is, what is the opinion of people? Are people interested in euthanasia in Argentina? What do you know about that?
Yes, there was an official survey that showed that more than 60% of Argentinians will ask for assisted dying. But it's different. We are the church. It's different. The public opinion differs from the Catholic Church's opinion, and one has more weight than the other, and that's a really big problem. The same thing happens with abortion. At 70% are for abortion, but the Catholic Church is not, so we don't have abortion in Argentina. Legal abortion, of course, right? We have the other one. It's really a health problem. But the same thing happens with euthanasia. And let me be clear with this, it's not that euthanasia is not practiced in Argentina. It is practiced, of course. It has been practiced for many, many years now, but it's all quiet and silent and nobody talks about it. And sometimes, and that's the real problem, I think, sometimes it's the physician who decides. And it's not the family, it's not the patient, it's just the physician. Do not resuscitate these people, do not do that, do not give this treatment. And they talk between them and not with the family of the patients. And that's because we don't have a good law to articulate this.
All right, next question. Yes, back here.
Is a distinction being made between euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide?
In Argentina,
Is there a difference between euthanasia and a physician-assisted suicide? Is that correct?
no, it's a really big problem because it's a definition problem. What the public understands for euthanasia is like actively pursuing the death of someone. But no, we don't have a law definition.
And does the law